In the winter of 1898, a British customs officer standing at the port of Calcutta made a note in his ledger that would puzzle historians for more than a century. He wrote that a certain golden powder, packed in sealed clay jars and guarded more closely than opium, was being taxed at a rate higher than silk. He did not understand why. The powder was not a drug. It was not a jewel. It came from a root that grew in the mud of ordinary fields, harvested by farmers who had never left their villages. And yet, for reasons the officer could not explain in his own report, entire fortunes had been built and lost over it, temples had been built to honor it, and wars had quietly shifted trade routes just to control where it grew. That root was turmeric, and the story of how a common rhizome pulled from the earth became one of the most fought over, worshipped, and misunderstood substances in human history is a story almost nobody has ever been told in full. To understand how something so humble became so powerful, you have to go back further than empires, further than written language itself, to a place where the story almost cannot be verified. And that is exactly what makes it so haunting. Somewhere in the river valleys of the Indian subcontinent, at least 4,000 years before our time, and by some genetic evidence perhaps even earlier, a wild ginger-like plant began to be deliberately cultivated by human hands. Botanists studying its DNA today believe turmeric, unlike many spices, has no true wild ancestor left anywhere on Earth. Every single turmeric plant alive today is descended from crops that ancient farmers bred and selected so long ago that the original wild version may be extinct. Think about that for a moment. This means human beings shaped turmeric into what it is before they had writing, before they had cities, before they had the wheel in that region. We quite literally created this plant's modern identity through thousands of years of quiet, patient agriculture, and yet almost no one alive today knows its name in the way they know pepper or cinnamon. It is the ghost spice of world history, everywhere and invisible at the same time. The earliest solid evidence comes from an unexpected place, not a temple, not a palace, but a humble cooking pot. In 2010, archaeologists excavating a Harappan civilization site at a location called Farmana in modern-day India found traces baked into ancient pottery that chemical analysis proved were turmeric residue mixed with ginger and garlic. Dated to roughly 2500 BCE, this was not medicine, this was not ritual, it was dinner. Ordinary people living in one of the world's first urban civilizations, alongside the Indus and Gaga rivers, were already blending turmeric into their meals more than 4,000 years ago. In cooking styles that would still be recognizable to a modern Indian kitchen today, it means turmeric's story does not begin with kings. It begins with hunger, with flavor, with a farmer noticing that this strange yellow root, when crushed, changed the color and the character of food, and perhaps changed something else too, something they could feel but not yet name. Because very quickly, this plant stopped behaving like an ordinary ingredient. In the sacred Sanskrit texts of the Vedic period, some composed as early as 1500 BCE, turmeric begins appearing not simply as food but as something almost otherworldly. Priests describe rubbing it onto the skin during purification rites. Brides had it painted onto their bodies before marriage, a tradition called haldi that endures in South Asian weddings to this very day. Unbroken across more than 3,000 years of continuous practice, few living traditions on earth can claim that kind of unbroken thread stretching back so far. When a modern bride in Mumbai or Delhi sits beneath golden paste applied by the hands of her family, she is participating in a ritual older than the Roman Empire, older than the Great Wall of China, older than the pyramids of the New Kingdom in Egypt, and she may not even know it. But why turmeric? Why this plant and not another? Ancient physicians practicing what would become Ayurvedic medicine, the vast medical system that developed across India over centuries, began to notice something. Wounds treated with turmeric paste seemed to heal differently. Skin conditions responded to it. The texts of Ayurveda, particularly the Sushruta Samhita, one of the oldest surgical treatises in human history, dated by scholars to somewhere between the 6th century BCE and a few centuries after, recommend turmeric preparations for wound dressing and for conditions of the skin and digestion. This was not superstition dressed up as science. This was empirical observation, repeated over countless generations, refined through trial, passed down through master and student, until an entire medical philosophy had turmeric embedded at its foundation. And here is the moment where the story takes its first genuinely surprising turn, because more than 2,000 years later, modern laboratories would return to this same plant and discover the ancient physicians may have been onto something real, though the full picture is far more complicated than any ancient scroll could have known. Modern science has isolated the primary compound responsible for turmeric's color and much of its biological activity. It is called curcumin. Since the 1970s, thousands of laboratory and animal studies have examined curcumin's effects, and it has shown genuine anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties in controlled settings. This is real, documented, and published in serious scientific journals. But here is what those ancient healers could never have known, and what modern headlines often fail to mention. Curcumin, when eaten in ordinary food, is absorbed extremely poorly by the human body. Clinical studies in humans, as opposed to laboratory dishes, have produced far less dramatic and far more mixed results than the more sensational claims circulating online would suggest. The scientific consensus today is cautious. Turmeric shows genuine promise. It is not a miracle cure, and no reputable researcher claims it replaces medicine. The truth, as it so often is in history, sits in the uncomfortable middle ground between ancient wisdom and modern skepticism. And that tension is itself part of what makes this story so compelling. A 4,000-year-old intuition about a golden root turns out to be neither myth nor magic, but something stranger, an unfinished scientific question still being asked in laboratories today. While healers were quietly documenting its effects, something else was happening to turmeric that would change the fate of nations. Its color, that impossible, saturated, sun-drenched yellow, deeper and warmer than any dye Europe had ever produced from its own soil, made turmeric something almost supernatural to those who first encountered it from outside Asia. Buddhist monks, spreading their faith eastward and westward along the ancient trade routes, adopted robes dyed with a saffron-orange hue, and while much of that dye historically came from other plant sources depending on the region, turmeric was among the dyes used across parts of South and Southeast Asia specifically because it was more affordable than true saffron and produced a comparable golden radiance. To wear that color was to visually announce a renunciation of material wealth, and yet the color itself came from a plant so valuable that controlling its trade could make a merchant wealthy beyond imagination. There is a bitter irony buried in that fact that few people ever stop to consider. The symbol of poverty and spiritual simplicity was dyed using one of the ancient world's most fiercely guarded commercial secrets. By the time Roman traders were sailing the monsoon winds toward India, seeking pepper, cinnamon, and other treasures of the East, turmeric was already so embedded in South Asian life that it barely registered as a separate luxury good the way pepper did. Because unlike pepper, turmeric was primarily consumed within the region that grew it. Yet this changes dramatically as trade networks expand. By the medieval period, Arab traders were carrying turmeric westward along the same routes that carried silk and porcelain, and it appears in medical texts across the Islamic world, where physicians building on Greek, Persian, and Indian medical traditions incorporated it into their own pharmacology. This is a detail almost never told in popular history, that turmeric quietly crossed three separate ancient medical civilizations, Indian, Islamic, and eventually European, each one testing it, writing about it, and passing it forward like a secret whispered across centuries. Then, in the 13th century, one of history's most famous travelers gave turmeric a mention that has puzzled historians ever since. Marco Polo, describing his travels through parts of China in his famous account, wrote of a plant with qualities resembling saffron, describing its color and aroma, though not literally saffron itself. Some historians believe he was describing turmeric, encountered in regions where it was cultivated as both spice and dye, a substance so visually convincing in its golden hue that a seasoned European traveler, who had presumably seen real saffron in Mediterranean markets, still felt compelled to compare the two. That comparison would end up being turmeric's blessing and its curse for the next several hundred years, because in Europe, it became known unofficially as Indian saffron, a cheaper golden substitute, and this misidentification meant that for centuries Europeans undervalued turmeric, seeing it merely as an inferior stand-in for something else. rather than recognizing it as its own distinct treasure with its own ancient civilization behind it. This misunderstanding had consequences that rippled forward into the age of European colonial expansion. When Portuguese ships rounded the Cape of Good Hope in the late 15th century and established the first direct sea route between Europe and India, they were hunting primarily for pepper, cinnamon, and cloves, the spices that commanded the highest prices back home. Turmeric, still viewed as a lesser golden curiosity rather than a prize commodity, did not trigger the same violent scramble for monopoly control that other spices did. And in a strange twist of historical fate, this relative neglect may have been turmeric's saving grace. While cinnamon forests in Ceylon were burned by Dutch colonial forces to control supply and inflate prices, while entire clove-producing islands in the Banda Sea were subjected to brutal colonial monopolies enforced through violence, turmeric continued to be grown, traded, and used relatively undisturbed across the vast farming communities of India, protected almost by its own perceived ordinariness. Sometimes in history, being underestimated is the only thing that keeps you alive. But do not mistake underestimation for irrelevance, because turmeric was quietly working its way into economies far beyond South Asia in ways that most people never learn in school. In parts of medieval and early modern Europe, turmeric found use not primarily in the kitchen, but in the dye vats of textile workers, where it colored fabrics, and it appears in historical trade and customs records as a commodity moving through ports like Venice, one of the great gateway cities connecting the Mediterranean world to the riches of the East. Venetian merchants, whose entire civilization was built on controlling the flow of Eastern goods into Europe, handled turmeric alongside their more famous spice cargoes, and its presence in their ledgers is a quiet reminder that history's grand economic stories are rarely built on a single ingredient, but on the accumulated weight of dozens of lesser known goods moving together across the same ships, the same roads, the same human hands. Then came a turning point that connects turmeric to one of the most consequential culinary transformations in modern history, the birth of curry powder as the Western world came to know it. During the height of British colonial rule in India, spanning the late 18th and 19th centuries, British administrators, soldiers, and merchants encountered the vast and varied spice blends used in Indian regional cooking, blends that had no single fixed recipe and varied enormously from household to household, region to region, generation to generation. But the British, seeking a way to package and export a simplified version of these flavors back to England, created something new, a standardized commercial blend they called curry powder, with turmeric as its defining golden base ingredient. This is a genuinely surprising fact that most people never realize. The bright yellow curry powder found in supermarkets across Britain, America, and much of the Western world today is not, and never was, an authentic single dish from India. It is a colonial-era commercial invention, a simplified Western interpretation stitched together from countless distinct culinary traditions, and turmeric became its permanent signature color, forever linking this ancient root to a global food category that most consumers assume is far older and far more monolithic than it actually is. And here the story takes another unexpected turn, because as British colonial trade networks expanded, turmeric traveled with soldiers, merchants, and indentured laborers to places its ancient cultivators could never have imagined: the Caribbean islands, Fiji, Mauritius, South Africa, and beyond, carried in the memories and cooking traditions of Indian workers, transported under often brutal indentured labor systems in the 19th century following the abolition of slavery in British territories. Wherever these communities settled, turmeric took root again, both literally in gardens and figuratively in new hybrid cuisines that blended Indian tradition with Caribbean, African, and Pacific Island ingredients. In Jamaica, in Trinidad, in Fiji, turmeric became naturalized into entirely new cultural identities, carried not by kings or conquerors, but by ordinary laboring families who refused to let go of the one golden thread connecting them to a homeland many of them would never see again. There is something profoundly moving in that fact, that a spice can become a form of memory, a way of keeping a lost world alive in a bowl of food cooked thousands of miles from where the recipe was born. Meanwhile, back in its ancestral homeland, turmeric never lost its sacred status, and its religious significance runs deeper than most outside observers realize. In Hindu tradition, turmeric is closely associated with purity, prosperity, and the goddess Lakshmi, and it is used in countless rituals beyond weddings, from housewarming ceremonies to religious festivals across the subcontinent. In some regions of India, farmers still perform ceremonies honoring turmeric itself at harvest time, treating the plant not merely as an agricultural product, but as something closer to a living blessing pulled from the soil. This is a detail almost entirely absent from Western discussions of the spice, that in its home civilization, turmeric was never simply a commodity to be bought, sold, and consumed. It was, and in many communities still is, a sacred participant in the great rituals of human life, present at births, marriages, festivals, and endings. By the 20th century, as global trade accelerated and scientific curiosity turned toward the chemical composition of traditional remedies from around the world, turmeric entered a completely new chapter of its long life, becoming the subject of serious biochemical research. Curcumin was first isolated and studied chemically by European scientists in the 19th century, but it was in the latter half of the 20th century, and especially since the 1970s and 1980s, that research accelerated dramatically, driven by growing scientific interest in plant-derived compounds and their potential health applications. This period produced a genuine explosion of published studies, and by some counts, curcumin has become one of the most extensively studied natural compounds in modern pharmaceutical research, appearing in thousands of peer-reviewed papers. And yet, in a twist that feels almost poetic given the plant's entire history of being underestimated and misunderstood, this flood of research has produced results that are far more nuanced than the marketing claims found on supplement bottles today would suggest. Reputable scientific reviews consistently note that while curcumin shows measurable anti-inflammatory and antioxidant activity in laboratory and animal studies, robust, large-scale human clinical trials proving significant therapeutic benefits remain limited, and the compound's poor natural bioavailability in the human digestive system remains a major unresolved scientific challenge. Turmeric is not snake oil, and it is not a miracle cure. It occupies a genuinely fascinating scientific middle ground, an ancient substance whose full story modern medicine still has not finished writing, a mystery layered on top of a much older mystery. There is one more twist in turmeric's long journey worth telling, because it reveals something uncomfortable about how history repeats itself. In 1995, two researchers in the United States were granted a patent by the United States Patent and Trademark Office for the use of turmeric powder in wound healing, treating it as a novel invention. When this became public, it triggered outrage across India, because turmeric's wound healing use had been documented in Ayurvedic texts for well over 2,000 years, freely practiced and shared knowledge belonging to no single inventor. India's Council of Scientific and Industrial Research formally challenged the patent, submitting ancient Sanskrit texts and historical documentation as evidence of prior use, and in 1997, the United States Patent Office revoked the patent, marking one of the first major legal victories in the modern world for what is now called traditional knowledge protection against biopiracy. It was a strange kind of historical justice, an ancient route reaching across 4,000 years to defend itself in a modern courtroom, proving that some forms of ownership cannot simply be claimed on paper, no matter how official the paper looks. And so this humble golden root, dug from the mud of river valleys before the invention of writing, carried across oceans in the memories of indentured laborers, painted onto the skin of brides for over 3,000 unbroken years, misidentified by one of history's most famous explorers, quietly spared the violent monopolization that destroyed other spice economies, transformed into a colonial commercial invention that millions mistake for ancient authenticity, defended in an American courtroom by the weight of its own impossibly deep history, and still today sitting in laboratories as an unfinished scientific question, asks something of us that few other objects in human history can ask. It asks us to reconsider what we think we know about value itself. We tend to measure history's importance through gold, through conquest, through the names of kings carved into stone, but turmeric's story suggests something quieter and perhaps more true, that the most enduring power in human history rarely announces itself with armies or crowns. Sometimes it grows silently in the mud, gets crushed by patient hands into a color no one can look away from, and outlives every empire that ever tried to claim it, waiting patiently in kitchens and temples and laboratories for us to finally understand what we have been holding on to all along.